The wife overheard a conversation between her husband and his mistress on her birthday, but when she made an announcement, everyone froze. Mercedes always considered herself a good person. Righteous, virtuous, empathetic, and understanding, she knew exactly what she wanted from life. Though she was quite young, having just graduated from university and started working at a small firm as an architect's assistant, Mercedes could not say she was naive. On the contrary, raised by a strict but kind single mother, she had always been driven and sensible, which was why she got the job at the rapidly growing firm in the first place. In just a few months, she had managed to prove to her colleagues that she not only had a keen sense of taste and an understanding of architecture and projects, but also the ambition to become a leading architect in the future. And it seemed life was going smoothly until Mercedes met the one person who turned everything upside down. That's how life usually goes. Their meeting took place in the lobby of the business center where her architectural firm was located. Diego was heading to a meeting with her colleague to discuss a potential project. The man gallantly held the elevator door when the girl almost missed getting in, and from his one smile, Mercedes suddenly realized she would never forget this man. Previously, she did not believe in love at first sight, but at that moment, that's exactly what happened to her. As the elevator doors closed behind her, the man nodded to her. "Rough day?" Mercedes noticed his gaze on the folders in her hands and awkwardly smiled, embarrassed by the attention of this handsome man, whose deep eyes almost made her knees weak. "A lot of work." "Thank you for holding the elevator for me," Mercedes replied. "For such a beauty, it's no trouble," the man's smile widened. "Which floor?" "Fifth." She glanced at the elevator buttons and saw that her floor was already lit up, indicating her fellow passenger was heading there too. "Oh, so you're coming to us?" "Yes, I have a meeting with Senor Rodrigo." Mercedes recalled that her boss was to meet someone to discuss a potential project for a new building. Mercedes Solis, she awkwardly freed her hand from under the stack of folders and extended it to the man. "Assistant to Senor Rodrigo." "Nice to meet you." Diego Mendez, the man shook her hand very gently. Thus began their acquaintance. The man came to her firm for meetings many times, and almost every time they saw each other in the office, until one day he left her his phone number. Mercedes didn't hesitate long, and the next day Diego invited her to a cafe. Charming, empathetic, and intelligent, the man quickly won the girl's heart. She involuntarily compared their relationship to those in romantic movies. He was so courteous, generous, and attentive that he swept her off her feet with his signs of attention. At every meeting, he brought her bouquets of flowers and small but not inexpensive gifts. He spoke beautifully, praising her beauty and intelligence. Never before had Mercedes felt so happy and loved. She considered herself lucky that such a respectable man noticed her. Undoubtedly, she was a beauty, with emerald eyes and a beautiful figure. Mercedes always attracted the attention of the opposite sex. But the few flings she had while studying were nothing compared to what she felt for Diego. He brought warmth and hope for a happy future into her life. Everything would have been perfect if he hadn't confessed to her one cruel secret he had been keeping for several months. Mercedes, though Diego had been smiling at the start of their meeting, now he looked sad. "I need to confess something to you." The girl tensed, suspecting he had lost interest in her and was ready to break up. "Don't be afraid, it's not about our relationship, but Diego noticed her expression and began to explain hurriedly what had been weighing on him. "I was afraid to tell you this, just everything is so complicated in my life, and I didn't want to worry you." "Diego, my love, what happened that you decided to hide something from me?" Mercedes sighed, clutching the gorgeous bouquet of red roses he had given her before their walk in the park. "Honestly, I was afraid it would make you hate me," the man sighed. "Understand, I had to find the strength to tell you this." "What is it you want to say?" "You see, I'm not quite." Diego paused for a few moments, then took a deep breath. "I have 2 children. 2 wonderful sons." Mercedes blinked in surprise. Children? Were children a hindrance to their relationship? On the contrary, the girl was even delighted, as she had long wanted to tell him about her own terrible secret. She dreamed of having a family but couldn't bring herself to tell him that in her youth she had suffered a terrible illness that led doctors to remove her ovaries. She couldn't have children, no matter how much she wanted them. "But that's wonderful," she exclaimed, smiling. "Children are a blessing." There was a strange spark in Diego's eyes, something that made Mercedes feel he was hesitating about what he wanted to say. "You don't understand, I am not yet divorced from my wife," the man said. These words hit Mercedes like a meteorite. For several long, painful moments, she was silent, trying to grasp the gravity of the situation. On one hand, she loved Diego like no one she had ever loved before. On the other, he had lied to her. Diego, Mercedes' voice almost failed her. But how? She fell silent, unable to hold back the tears that welled up in her eyes. "Mercedes, please understand. I delayed the divorce for the sake of the children. They're still too young, and I didn't want our relationship to affect them. Believe me, I have no intention of staying with Luisa. I plan to divorce, it's just..." Children, something in that word helped Mercedes control the emotions that were almost overwhelming her. "Children are very important, you're right. How old are they?" Diego took a very deep breath and replied. "Marcel is 12. Luis is 10. Mercedes slowly nodded, agreeing that the children were still too young to understand the full impact of their parents' divorce. Without a doubt, if Diego divorced his wife, the children's relationship with their father could suffer greatly. And in the boys' lives, a father's presence was crucial, otherwise, the lack of male upbringing could affect the kind of men they would grow up to be. The girl began to cautiously ask her beloved about his family, and he seemed to answer her questions honestly. It took some time for Mercedes to understand what was really happening in Diego's life. Eventually, she was convinced that the man was being honest with her, and according to him, he and his wife hadn't even slept in the same room for a long time. Essentially, Diego said, they had been living separately for a while but pretended to be a happy family only for the sake of the children. "Luisa used to be a wonderful woman. But after the birth of our youngest son, she gradually became distant and irritable, always looking for reasons to argue or yell at me. Eventually, we decided it was time to end this charade. Yes, we're not divorced yet, but there's been nothing between us for a long time. We just keep up appearances. We go to our relatives with the boys, throw parties for our mutual friends," Diego explained. Mercedes was satisfied with his explanations, and the feeling that she was destroying someone's family dissipated. After all, if Diego said that his wife was unbearable and they were together only for the sake of their sons, then that was how it was. As days passed, Mercedes gradually learned more about Marcel and Luis, slowly realizing that the children were wonderful. And although she could not see them, Diego shared their school achievements, showed her photos from holidays and events, and told her funny stories that happened to them. Mercedes began to feel as if these children were her own too, even though they had not yet met in person. But that did not stop her from loving them both, intelligent, sensible, and energetic, engaged in so many things that undoubtedly they had a bright future ahead of them. The girl began to dream of the day when she would finally meet them and get to know them truly. She already felt proud of Marcel and Luis, even though they were unaware of it. And Diego, she still loved him madly and believed every word he said, even though sometimes she felt like a shameless homewrecker or some sort of immoral woman. But each time Diego assured her that once the children grew up, he would definitely divorce his wife and they could live together, openly and without any worries. Mercedes believed his every word. She couldn't help but believe. After all, love is blind and incredibly dangerous when it consumes the entire heart, clouding the mind and the voice of reason. The girl comforted herself with the thought that she had entered this affair voluntarily. Besides, Diego always complained about his family life. "There's been no warmth or love between Luisa and me for a long time. Only patience and an understanding of the importance of maintaining the semblance of a couple for the sake of our children," Diego said once again. "I'm sure she's already found herself a man. She's often not at home, always on her phone. Mercedes listened to him, understanding that while it might seem like he was cheating on his wife, it was far from the truth. A year passed. Then another. And another. And Diego kept stalling the divorce and telling Mercedes that it was not yet time. The girl believed him, patiently waiting for her turn, understanding the entire situation. In some way, she began to envy the fact that Diego's unloved wife, who, undoubtedly, was seeing other men, and judging by his words, several at once, lived with him and could claim some semblance of family happiness, even if it was superficial. Mercedes often thought about how they had dinner together every night, all of them, with the children whom she still hadn't seen in person, contenting herself only with photos and stories from their father. She felt envious when she pictured this scene and very much wished that she could be in Diego's wife's place. And yet, she began to have doubts. Diego was not going to leave his wife, nor was he letting go of Mercedes. Even though he behaved like a gentleman, something about how he kept delaying didn't sit right. The girl found Diego's wife on social media and began to gradually follow what she posted. New posts appeared almost every day. And as soon as Mercedes scrolled through the available photos and old posts, she realized that Luisa seemed like a cheerful woman who tried to be, or at least appear to be, a caring wife, mother, and friend. Mercedes herself gradually became more involved in Luisa's life. The thought that Diego was not entirely honest still haunted her, and Mercedes gradually realized that he might simply be deceiving both of them. She knew how she could find out the truth about what was happening at Diego's home. All she had to do was befriend Luisa, and in ordinary, casual conversations between new acquaintances, she could find out, was everything as Diego described, or was it different? And so, the girl decided to take radical measures. She unobtrusively added Luisa to her contacts, justifying her friend request by saying she had found her in some group. Communication between them started immediately. The women found many topics to discuss, quickly became friends, and began to communicate almost every day. Mercedes restrained herself from telling Luisa about what Diego was doing. She just listened, asked the woman about her life and children, and noted for herself the stark differences from Diego's accounts of what was happening at home. And when Mercedes directly asked Diego about the family, the man either remained silent, dismissing the uncomfortable topic, or answered briefly and monosyllabically. It seemed that all he cared about were Mercedes' embraces and nothing more. "Don't think about it, my love," he said to her, using gentle touches and kisses to distract her. "Come to me instead, I've missed you so much." The girl succumbed to this passion, but as soon as Diego left her, her thoughts returned to Luisa and their children. She could not stop thinking that the circumstances were horrifying. On the one hand, Diego was clearly lying to her about what was happening in his life with Luisa. On the other, his wife seemed like a very kind and responsive woman who did not deserve such treatment. Something had to be done, but Mercedes had no idea how to go about it. She was frankly afraid to tell Luisa that she was having an affair with Diego, her husband. And while the girl was torn by painful thoughts, life dealt her another blow. One day, when they met, Diego was smiling, as if excited and happy about some news he was eager to share with Mercedes. "My love, I want to invite you to a celebration," the man immediately announced as soon as he hugged and kissed his lover. "What's the occasion?" Mercedes secretly hoped it was to celebrate his divorce. Despite all the evidence that Diego was lying, she still loved the man. "It doesn't matter, darling. Just come, and I'll be immensely happy to see you among my friends, colleagues, and close people." Diego brushed off her direct question, handing her an invitation with the address of the event, the date, and time. He dismissed the topic again, once more engaging the girl in their usual pleasures and tenderness, making her forget what bothered her about his behavior. But once again, when he left her embrace and went home, to his children, she was left alone with her tormenting thoughts. Hearing a sudden notification, Mercedes saw that Luisa had posted in the social media news feed, saying she was looking forward to the upcoming celebration of her wedding anniversary. Frowning, the girl checked the dates and suddenly realized which celebration Diego had invited her to. The realization that the man had no intention of changing anything hit Mercedes with full force, nearly bringing her to tears. She understood that their relationship would never change. He would stay with his wife, continuing to lie to her without a doubt, while simultaneously seeing Mercedes, who was merely his mistress. She felt not just deceived, but used and betrayed by a man who so often swore his love to her. It was time to take matters into her own hands. Mercedes began to think about what she could do and started carefully planning everything for the celebration: what dress to wear to look beautiful but not too provocative, which shoes to choose, and what handbag to carry. She intended to appear in all her glory, but hoped not to attract too much attention. Whatever happened at the event, she would look beautiful. When the day of the celebration arrived, Mercedes went to the specified address, realizing that Diego hadn't skimped. The event took place in a very expensive restaurant, in a spacious and beautifully decorated banquet hall. Seeing the guests dressed in expensive suits and dresses, Mercedes immediately forgot about her nerves that flared up on the way. Now it seemed to her that she had not overdone it with the choice of a beautiful silk dress that perfectly highlighted her slender figure. Her arrival was unnoticed. At least, she was sure Diego didn't see her when she appeared among the guests. This worked in her favor. She could look around and observe how Diego behaved with his wife to understand definitively whether he would keep his word or not. And although guilt continued to torment her, she noticed very strange behavior. Luisa seemed smiling, open, and not at all like the bitch Diego described her as. And when she reached out to take his hand or hug him, Diego pulled away and made a face as if he had just eaten a very sour lime. And during conversations with guests, Diego's behavior changed for the worse. He interrupted his wife, belittled her achievements and thoughts, and did not miss a chance to make fun of her or joke hurtfully, all in front of the gathered guests. And these were the terrible relationships Diego had told her about? With each passing moment, Mercedes understood better. It wasn't Luisa who was the cause of their bad relationship, but Diego. The rose-colored glasses were coming off, and she finally saw her lover clearly for the first time, not clouded by boundless love. Watching the couple, Mercedes decided to find out more about them, and she was lucky to overhear a conversation among a group of guests, from which she learned that it wasn't that simple. "You didn't know, sir," an elderly woman in a beautiful blue dress said to her companion. "Luisa is the daughter of a musician. And although he's not widely known, he made quite a fortune in his lifetime by composing music for films and musicals. Oh, I've been to his orchestra performances. He was a real maestro." "For movies, you say?" The woman's companion raised an eyebrow, sipping champagne. When the woman began listing the films with music by Luisa's father, Mercedes realized that Diego's wife was clearly not poor, and this was likely the reason Diego was stalling the divorce. He didn't want to leave a woman whose means allowed him to live lavishly without worrying about expenses. Mercedes felt a pang in her heart. Luisa and Diego's marriage was a calculated one. But not in the way she had thought. It wasn't Luisa holding onto the man, but rather Diego clinging to her and refusing to let go. Diego was vain, and this proximity to someone else's fame allowed him to brag that he had married the daughter of a famous musician. He, of course, kept silent about wanting the money left to Luisa after her father's death. Her inheritance was his inheritance too. After all, they were married. Mercedes was surprised that she hadn't known about Luisa's wealth all the time she spent following the woman's social media and briefly communicating with her. She never saw any hint of excessive wealth or her background. Luisa turned out to be a modest and simple woman, preferring not to flaunt either her wealth or the fact that her father was a musician who had won many hearts. Mercedes noticed Diego leaving his wife and heading towards a group of men, and by the way, he started laughing with them. She realized that he was among friends, or at least good acquaintances. Looking at Luisa, Mercedes saw the woman seemed to be sad for a couple of moments, but as soon as someone approached her, a smile reappeared on her face, though it didn't reach her beautiful eyes. Mercedes gathered her strength and approached the woman, wanting to talk to her, even if just a little. Luisa smiled when Mercedes got close. For a couple of moments, she frowned slightly, seeing the girl, and then blinked. "Excuse me, I have the impression I've seen you somewhere, miss." Mercedes decided not to hide her name but didn't want to reveal too soon why she was at the celebration. I have the same feeling, she said with a smile. Did Diego invite you? Are you a colleague or? Luisa glanced towards her husband. Yes, Mercedes clung to a bit of truth. We worked on a project together. Luisa relaxed, though a moment ago she had been a bit tense, not knowing who was in front of her. Luisa, the woman extended her hand. Mercedes smiled back, gently shaking her hand. Luisa's face showed a surprised expression. Mercedes Solis? No wonder your face seemed familiar. We chat on social media. Mercedes hid her tension behind a broad smile. That's right. I'm sorry, I didn't recognize you at first. Oh, don't worry, Mercedes. We all look a bit different on social media. Mercedes felt a bit lost, not knowing how to proceed, but then she remembered the guests' conversations about Luisa's father. And the girl started a topic about music, which made her companion's eyes light up, as if she remembered her father's works with warmth and joy. They talked briefly, mainly about how her father's music influenced Luisa. Mercedes realized that this woman was so modest that she simply didn't know what benefit she could have gotten from her late father's reputation. She wasn't spoiled by her father's achievements or the money left to her. She sincerely and warmly remembered the times when he was with her and gave her unforgettable memories. But then Luisa looked away, and Mercedes involuntarily followed her gaze. The girl nearly flinched, seeing Diego's heavy, angry stare. Hastily turning away, Mercedes felt tears welling up in her eyes. She suddenly wanted to cry, from fear of Diego and from pity for Luisa. The man's wife seemed so wonderful and kind that she did not deserve the treatment Diego showed her. I'm sorry, I think I should go. Mercedes quickly apologized and, without hesitating for a second, headed away. She no longer wanted to stay in the hall, where guests' conversations and laughter filled the air. She didn't know if she should have come to this celebration at all and was ready to leave the restaurant and never think about this evening again. However, as she reached the corridor, where she could turn to the restrooms to compose herself, she heard hurried footsteps behind her. Mercedes! Diego hissed. The girl turned and saw anger and indignation on his face. How dare you? It was clear that Diego was trying not to shout, but he was struggling to hold back. How dare you show your face to my wife? And on such a day? Mercedes suddenly felt everything she had kept to herself for years rising from the depths of her heart. She glanced at the completely empty corridor, then took a very deep breath, holding back tears of resentment and shame with all her might, and her voice sounded confident and firm. How dare I? Me? How dare you cheat on your wife? Lie to both her and me. And the children. Maybe I haven't met them, but I grew to love them. They are so wonderful. And now I know why. Because they have a wonderful mother. And their father is a liar and a scoundrel. All your words are lies and deceit. You lied to me. And you lied to her. You will never leave her, but you won't let me leave you either. But now I am not so weak and defenseless before you, liar. With each word, the girl felt more confident, and her voice grew a little louder. I've had enough. I will no longer be your puppet, your occasional entertainment. You've caused me enough pain with your lies. I can't imagine what your wife would feel if she knew what you were doing behind her back. This innocent, kind, and modest woman loves you, and you turn up your nose and sneer at her signs of affection. She doesn't deserve such suffering. Diego didn't interrupt, but a very nasty smirk appeared on his face. He knew full well that his mistress had understood everything, pieced together all the parts of the puzzle, and seen the light. But he also knew he wouldn't let her ruin his sweet and wealthy life. He stepped toward her, roughly grabbing Mercedes by the shoulders and pulling her back against the wall. Listen here, you brainless doll. Diego hissed with hatred in his voice. Just dare tell Luisa about what happened between us, and I will destroy you, do you understand? I'm rich, I can make your life a living hell. Mercedes looked in fear into the eyes she once loved and realized she would never again let this man use her love and defenselessness. Tears of resentment and disgust for the man who had so cleverly hidden his true face streamed down her cheeks. "You're a liar," she said, turning away. "You'll never see me again." Diego grimaced in rage, roughly pushing the girl aside, and stormed off angrily. Mercedes nearly collapsed on her weakened legs and rushed to the restroom so that none of the guests would catch her crying in the corridor or at the restaurant exit. Immersed in her grief and self-pity, Mercedes wept in the restroom. She cursed herself and her naivety, blinded by desire and love, having allowed a true scoundrel to take advantage of her trust. The girl didn't hear the celebration continue, nor the event host inviting Louisa to the microphone. The woman walked up to the guests with an uncertain gait, as if gathering strength before speaking to the audience. Conversations, laughter, and jokes ceased. Everyone's eyes were on Louisa, who began her speech with a pleasant voice that trembled slightly. No one was surprised, understanding that the woman was unaccustomed to public speaking, unlike her father. She was clearly nervous as she spoke, but everyone smiled at her words. "I am so happy to see you all here," Louisa said. "My friends and family are by my side, and that's something to dream of at any moment in life. There's nothing better than seeing familiar faces and smiles, hearing jokes and laughter, and having a multitude of topics to discuss." People smiled wider, nodding in agreement with her words. And although there was silence in the hall, Louisa seemed to freeze, taking a very long pause. The woman looked at the guests and noticed the tension and confusion on their faces. This prolonged pause caused slight concern among the guests. Putting on a strained smile, Louisa met Diego's gaze and continued her speech. "Diego, my husband, whom I've loved all these years. You've worked so hard for the sake of our wonderful children." Louisa saw her husband smiling contentedly, and along with him, the other guests smiled too. Diego could easily be called an excellent father and husband. If it weren't for Mercedes. The guests frowned in surprise, and Louisa saw Diego's eyes widen as she continued her speech. "You know, every family has many acquaintances and friends, but I never would have thought that my most faithful and worthy friend would turn out to be Mercedes," the woman said, remembering how she had followed the girl when she ran off after their conversation. Louisa had so wanted the celebration to be joyful for everyone who came, and seeing tears in the guests' eyes, she wanted so much to ask her what had happened and how the situation could be fixed. Louisa had always been empathetic to others' grief and always ready to help, whether with words or deeds. She had followed Mercedes and saw how an irritated Diego dived into the corridor after the girl. Intrigued by this, Louisa slowed her pace. She entered the corridor cautiously and hid around the corner, overhearing her husband's conversation with the girl. Louisa stood in horror, hearing what Diego was saying to Mercedes, and clutched her mouth to avoid revealing herself to the couple. This girl, who turned out to be the man's mistress, was actually just a deceived woman who had grown to love his children and felt pity for her lover's wife because of his lies and deceit. Louisa understood how defenseless women could be in the face of love. She herself loved Diego so much that she didn't want to see how he really treated her. The woman realized she couldn't be angry at Mercedes. The girl was as deceived as Louisa herself. It was all Diego's fault, his and his alone. And now, delivering her speech, Louisa could finally express everything she truly thought. Mercedes is a very young girl, but she turned out to be the most faithful friend I could ever dream of. She wasn't afraid to reveal the lies and deceit of the person I considered the love of my life. You know, I don't hold a grudge against her because she is young and inexperienced. But the terrible burden of guilt lies on Diego's shoulders, and it's no longer worth staying silent about it. He dared to play a double game, deceiving two women, and his lies have been uncovered. This is a lesson for all of you. Lies are always discovered sooner or later. Louisa noticed Diego flinching, ready to drag her off the stage, but someone grabbed his hand, preventing him from doing so. He has neither conscience nor fear of God. And, you know, I can tell you why I'm not angry with his mistress. She didn't take him away from his family. He's not some goat or lamb to have a rope thrown around his neck and be led wherever someone pleases. I've never understood why mistresses are always blamed. After all, they're not the ones lying and deceiving their spouses. It's the spouses who choose deceit and infidelity, completely forgetting about the vows they made at the altar during the wedding. She continued speaking, and people listened to the woman in silence. Diego's mistress has more nobility in her than he does. And yet he prides himself on his nobility, which turned out to be a facade. In reality, he deceived and lied to two women, and when he got scared that his mistress would tell me everything, he started threatening her. To him, she was just a doll, a toy, not a living person, and I'm grateful to Mercedes for helping me see my husband's true face. Feeling empowered, Luisa pointed at her husband. You are a liar, Diego. A liar and a hypocrite. I was blind, but thanks to Mercedes, I have seen the truth, and the veil of your lies has fallen from my eyes. You love neither me nor her, you only used us both. You used me for my father's money and fame, and her for your carnal pleasures. The words poured out with such fury, as if pent-up indignation towards her husband had been hiding inside the woman for a long time. She went on, expressing everything she thought about the father of her children, her cheeks flushed with emotion. Finally, she finished her tirade and, noticing Mercedes slipping towards the exit, casually tossed the microphone onto the stage floor. As she headed after her husband's mistress, someone tried to stop her, but Luisa was so angry that she yanked her hand free and quickened her pace, wanting to leave the now deceitful celebration. Once outside, she saw Mercedes. The girl still looked depressed and sad. Diego's mistress approached Luisa hesitantly, and in the girl's green eyes, the woman saw sorrow and longing. I called a taxi, said Mercedes. We can leave together. I'll give you a ride. Nonsense, Luisa replied with a slight smile. We're both going to my place. Mercedes was taken aback by this statement, but didn't argue as the car had already arrived. The women got into the taxi and, without further words, headed to Luisa's house, where the first thing the woman did was invite Mercedes inside and offer her a drink to relax a bit after such an eventful evening at the restaurant. Will you help me pack this liar's things? Luisa asked the girl. Mercedes took a sip of the strong whiskey and marveled that Luisa truly held no grudge against her for sleeping with her husband. Are you really not angry with me? She asked. How could I be, Mercedes? It was he who lied. We are both victims of his vile deceit. Luisa waved her hand dismissively, turning on soft, unobtrusive music. Let's go. Without a word, they proceeded to pack the belongings of the man who had ruined their lives with his lies. Just over an hour later, someone started banging on the door and ringing the doorbell frantically. Luisa walked silently to the front door and, opening it, found her husband behind it. Diego was pale, nervous, and his eyes were filled with tears. Seeing his wife, he fell to his knees and clasped his hands, assuming a pose that Luisa might have called martyr-like. Luisa, listen to me, the man began. The woman didn't listen to his words, already understanding that he was scared for the life he loved. He was begging, crawling on his knees, and she wasn't even listening to his words because she knew he was lying again in an attempt to stay where it was comfortable, wealthy, and familiar for him. Forgive me, Diego cried. Forgive me, I beg you. I'll do anything. Luisa noticed a change in his face when Mercedes appeared behind her. Diego immediately dropped the mask of a repentant martyr, and his eyes blazed with anger and hatred. His wife glanced back and saw Mercedes handing her a bag. The woman took it from the girl, not even allowing her husband to utter a word. When Luisa threw the bag with his things at his face, the stunned Diego fell, but as soon as he tried to get up, a second bag hit him, followed by a package that painfully struck his shoulder. Luisa and Mercedes exchanged glances, and the woman slammed the door shut in Diego's face, immediately locking it. The women heard the man sobbing, trying to say something, pleading for forgiveness, but they both felt no pity for this liar. On the contrary, after throwing the bags in the face of the man who had deceived them both, the two women suddenly felt such relief that they couldn't hold back their laughter. The evening, which had begun joyfully and happily, filled with anticipation of celebration and fun, ended in complete stress and anxiety. Nonetheless, both Louisa and Mercedes, who had found the strength to confront the man who had been fooling them both for so long, finally felt some satisfaction with the outcome of the evening. Sitting in the kitchen and sipping whiskey, the women started talking more freely. It turned out they had a lot in common, apart from the man who had deceived them, of course. Louisa was surprised to learn that Mercedes had been observing her life from the sidelines for a long time before writing to her for the first time. There was something pleasant about the girl's interest in their family life. It was as if she were a lost relative who had hesitated to speak to them for a long time. She genuinely cared about the children, and about Louisa herself too. This compassion brought a smile to Louisa's face. The girl, whose society would mostly call a homewrecker, turned out to be more attentive than Diego and knew more than the man who had played the role of a respectable husband for so many years. However, Mercedes had no idea that Diego had forced Louisa to be a housewife, and that was why she didn't work, spending most of her time at home with the children. The girl listened in surprise as Louisa talked about how she used to work, but then gave in to Diego's pressure and became a stay-at-home mom. This is how a friendship began between Louisa and Mercedes. During the divorce process, the girl supported Louisa and her children, repeatedly showing herself to be kind and empathetic. The divorce didn't take long, and in the end, Diego was left with nothing, disgraced, abandoned by both women, and stripped of wealth and respect. Meanwhile, Mercedes and Louisa became such good friends that their lives became brighter. Louisa blossomed, going back to work and balancing it with caring for her children. And the two boys, now grown, not only understood their parents' separation but also often visited the suddenly appeared aunt, whom they had never been told about before. Mercedes was happy that out of the whole situation with Diego, she had gained a wonderful and loyal friend who understood her better than anyone else, and two rascals who loved her as a fond and kind aunt. Sometimes you have to go through terrible circumstances to find your way to something good. And for Mercedes, that's exactly what happened.